Really nice to meet you today. So I'll just kick off and directly jump into the topic today. My topic today is resource endowment, political stability, and water securitization motivations in the case of Kazakhstan. Although I'm not a regional expert, but I just figured it's the case of Kazakhstan would be a very meaningful to some of the research. So that is the reason, also is the reason why I choose to get my research start. So I'll just start my research question here. You know, like last session I joined, one of the panelists, Farah, she mentioned people just don't care about puzzles, don't care about questions. I totally agree with that, but still I have to throw my research questions here. When we're talking about like water in Central Asia, we all know that Central Asia are currently having a difficult situation in water cooperation, and especially the uneven distribution of the water, whereas the nation actually requires more water, especially for the high water absorbing industries. This actually increased the water demand in this region. There are some lower level of, well, we don't just say that's conflicts, but there are something happen related to security. So the former president of Uzbekistan has ever warned Tajikistan to stop building the Rogan Dam, otherwise there's going to be a water war. So in this case, he just had a feeling that the water is being threatened. So we all know that there are a lot of cases like securitizing water would have risk. So why nations still choose to securitize water in their policy agenda? So a little bit saying about water securitization. So we all know that securitization as a term has been brought up in 1993 by Oliver. They were talking about the securitization, meaning the issue is presented as an existential threat, requiring emergency measures and justifying actions outside normal bounds of political procedures. So therefore, like in very simplest way, in the water securitization case, we could just say that water as a topic has been brought into the national security agenda. They agree that, oh, water now is a threat to our nation, to our people's livelihoods, then this is considered that water is being securitized. So normally for the securitization procedures, there are 4 steps. So the first thing that we say that water resources are threatened, it could be threatened by upstream countries, could be threatened by, let's say, climate change. Decision makers will think that way. And then the government and elites will take measures. For example, they will initiate or they will put out water laws. They will put out some regulations, and they will probably have lots of projects and programs related to the water management. And then there are a lot of interactions among the different actors, different level of actors, government, elites, public, NGO, you name it, about this topic. Then we can see there are a lot of speeches, there are a lot of narratives happening in this state, saying that, oh, water security is really important to our nation, and water now has been brought into security agenda. And then public eventually accepted this as a security issue. So I'll just speak a little bit about where this question is from. This question is actually from the research gap between theory and practice. So we all know that there are a lot of theories talking about water conflict or water cooperation. We have lots of models. We have homo-distance models. We have Mark Zagman and Jeremy Warner's models. We have Naomi Lamachi's conflict and cooperation model, saying that conflict and cooperation coexist in basins. We also have institution effectiveness, and that institution involved could actually help to coordinate water cooperation. All these kind of things are suggesting that, well, all this shit, I believe our goal right here is just to say what things could be a driver for water cooperation. However, in the practice in the Central Asia, we can see that start from the 1990s, the cooperation seems did well. There are some of the agreements. They are having the institution there. However, it's just cooperation decreases at that moment. So if you take a look at the Transboundary Freshwater Database Dispute Database, TFDD. They record lots of events happened in the Central Asia, saying that start from 1990s to 2007. 24 out of 75, only 24 events are related to water corporation. So that is sort of a lower proportion. So for the previous explanations, a lot of the studies offer insight into the drivers of water securitization. I have no idea what it's okay, that's fine. But yeah, so we have the historical perspectives. We all know that Soviet Union did have a central water policy, and we have the barter system. So upstream countries give water to downstream countries, and then downstream countries give back the energy for this barter system. And then once after the breakdown of the Soviet Union, so the 5 nations, they become like 70 nations. They just don't have better options for this water management. Then we have the institution deficiency, saying that there are a lot of water agencies and institutions in Central Asia. However, there's just lack of effectiveness to do so. And we also have like water scarcity explanation, saying that because of the water scarcity, they just feel like very insecure and then get the water securitized. So here's my explanation. Might be a little bit, I will try to explain, and I'll try my best. So I just, like, in my opinion, I just figured the resource endowment, by here resource endowment means just the water resource. Resource endowment and political stability are the 2 important factors that would affect the decision makers to eventually make this decision to securitize water. So in order to be more straightforward, I simplify these 2 factors into the two aspects. For example, I explain the resource endowment into upstream advantages and water quality comparisons. For example, if there are countries they're in downstream and they feel like they don't have enough water to use, they just have a feeling that the resource endowment is pretty low. And that's a similar thing to the political stability. So if there are a high-level cooperation, a high-level consensus at the elite level, whereas the lower social protests and unrest happening there, the political stability is going to be high. So for the water securitization part, if suddenly a nation internally increasing the consensus on water security, they have a lot of speeches, they have a lot of narratives on this. This is the showcase of water securitization. I hate this word. And there, or then we have like 3 scenarios. If we have normal resource endowment, that means like, oh, you have enough water, I'm in a better position. And have high political stability, then you have the weakest motivation to get it securitized. So it's just like this. So comes into the case studies, the motivational adjustments for water securitization in Kazakhstan. So I just feel like when I'm trying to collect the different materials of the Kazakhstan, I just figured there are very clear 3 phases. So from the loan securitization from 1991 to 1996, there is low securitization for Kazakhstan because there are lots of cooperation arrangements, cooperation agreements happening here, and public being very optimistic, especially when I check some materials and archives. They're saying that people just think the water right now is an unlimited resource. So they don't actually have too much securitization motives right now. But start from the 1997 to 2012, they just feel like the Kazakhstan government just feel like they have a moderate securitization motives, especially they feel like the water demands increase, and that's where they have a lot of water law and regulations happening at this moment. At this moment, similarly, they are also have been negatively affected by the unilateral actions of upstream countries during this period, and especially some farmers in southern Kazakhstan were outraged when Uzbekistan cut off 70% of the Surdaya River's water flow to Kazakhstan in July 1997, which actually affecting water for irrigated agriculture in the south of the country. And like Uzbekistan on July 24th of 1997 just opposed the unilateral act to cut off the water to downstream. So this kind of things consistently happen. Then we move to the case I want to show today is actually the third case, the high securitization model from 2013 to 2020, from 2023. So some general information, well, thanks to the training the first day, I will be able to use the strata to actually show a little bit water risk in this country. So the red areas are actually their projection, their data showing that this area has the higher water risk. And for the map at the right side, it just shows there are a lot of Kazakhstan are actually having a very uneven distribution of water, which they have from north to south. They have lower water data. And here is the high securitization mode. So if we look at the resource endowment here, actually start from 2013, Kazakhstan, there are a series of reports from the UN, from World Bank, saying that Kazakhstan will face a severe shortage of water and only be able to meet 50% of its domestic needs. And then start from the 2014, they initiated the Kazakhstan 2050 strategy, and this is the first document. They clearly stress that water scarcity, that water is a security issue, and they care more about the quantity than the quality at this moment. So they just figured, oh, we have less water right now, so this is quite an important issue. And for the political stability at this moment, so we can see, so if you search information, there are a lot of public information showing that there are lots of public protests right at this moment. There are a lot of environmental protests. For example, protect the Clingendael. This is a national park. The government eventually wanted to build some entertainment at that area, but this area will actually really affect the national park. So there are actually lots of protests happening there. So actually there is the Agency Environmental Justice at Lens and International Environmental Non-Governmental Organization described this protest at high level in terms of its reach and impact, and there are several of the environmental protests at this moment. And also for the country itself is during the election and the government shift at this moment. Although the shift was smooth, but then there are both Tokayev and the Nazarbayev are still in the center of the power. So some people are still questioning if the power shift has been successfully shifted to the next round.
2 minutes.
Thank you. So almost done. So this is the last part. So there are a lot of moves then, finding that Kazakhstan has brought the natural resources and the water into their national security. They have a national security law involving a lot of articles related to water, and this is actually considered to be a landmark event. And then there are lots of addresses, a lot of national address speeches in the meetings, speeches from the Tokayev speech in the United Nations. They are consistently concerned about water shortages and have emphasized the importance of water resources in many speeches, like he had mentioned water scarcity is serious. In most of the reality, the topics are moving to the realm of national security issues. So that is where they eventually make this as a security topic. So I will just leave some research implications and the practice implications here for the room to discuss. So this is only the first case to describe how water securitization is happening in the different regions. So maybe there are more other cases, maybe in Latin America, maybe in Africa. That is what I hope to do in the future. And the data archives, the info, there are a lot of, I joined the session of the big data session. I just feel like I was chatting, I almost lost my job. They're doing a really great job on the causal relation identification. That is really impressive. So we probably can use a lot of data in the future for this. And for the practice implication, I just want to use this research to show that water is highly related to the political stability in some of the areas. Maybe this could be time for the third party to be involved in, and then there are some other things happening to move to cooperation. So that is my presentation today. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We'll come back to you, but we will stay in the region as our next presenter is Eugénie Stoclet. Well, welcome. She's a PhD candidate at the Free University of Brussels in the Socio-Environmental Dynamics Research Group with a cool acronym, SONIA. Their work focuses on climate change impacts on water management in transboundary basins, especially in Central Asia. And as you can see here from the slide, we're not going far from where our previous speaker took us. So the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and thank you for being here today. Yeah, I must say that 2 presentations on water in Central Asia, road to road, it's maybe a little much for you, but you'll have to deal with that. Yeah, so I'm gonna talk about the relationship between climate change impacts on water, and then especially with conflict in the Sierra Darya Basin. So a few guidelines for my research, and I should mention that it's an ongoing work, so it's not finished. I'm still working on it, so if you have any advices, I'm always all ears. So I'm looking at how water conflicts and cooperation coexist in a transboundary basin such as the Sierra Darya, but that's more of the context for the rest, which is about how are climate change impacts linked to these dynamics, and how can adaptation be implemented in such situation. So just a few elements of context, so we are all on the same foot. First, that water is of course not distributed equally in time and space. It has been seen as an object of conflict. This vision has evolved, but it is still one of the factors that can trigger conflicts or be a casualty of or weapon linked to conflicts. But we should also mention that there are more instances of cooperation than of water, and that's true for the Sierra Darya Basin as well. And these dynamics of water conflicts and cooperation are not based on a continuum, but are coexisting on a day-to-day basis. And cooperation is not necessarily positive, but I will go back on that matter later. So a little bit of context with some of my fieldwork pictures, because why not? The Sierra Darya Basin, for some of you who don't know, is flowing from Kyrgyzstan, from the Tian Shan mountain range, to Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan again, then Kazakhstan, and flows to the Aral Sea. And it irrigates some important areas such as the Fergana Valley that you can see in red here, because it's a highly conflictive space. It's of course a transboundary river, and glaciers are the part of the water tower of the region and important part of the water cycle and water flow of this river. And the last part is that there is a high power differential between upstream countries and downstream countries, in a sense that downstream countries, namely Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, have more economic power, military power, but are in the weakest position in terms of where they are in the basin. And that is important because the shared area is highly impacted by the Soviet inheritance. So during the Soviet times, you had a highly centralized water management favoring downstream plains for irrigated agriculture to grow cotton mainly, and wheat also. And upstream and downstream countries, Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, were having a lot of dams and reservoirs in order to control the water flow. But the hydropower potential was not exploited in its full potential. It was really irrigation water flow. And as I'm so sorry, I won't pronounce your name correctly, but as you say, upstream countries and downstream countries during the Soviet era are complementary. So that was not really a problem. However, however, the situation after the collapse of the Soviet Union is that there is no centralized management of the river. And this is to show that the Central Asian countries are still among the highest, the countries with the highest total withdrawals per capita, despite these problems with water. So since 1991, the USSR left a few, let's say, a lot of tensions with the borders, with the water infrastructures, because upstream we have a lot of hydropower potential, because we have dams and hydropower plants that are already constructed, such as Toktogul, which is in Kyrgyzstan. Borders are disputed between countries, especially in fertile regions such as the Fergana Valley. We have problems with the water quotas that are negotiated at the end of the Soviet Union. And what we can see starting 1991 is that many agreements are actually signed between the countries, and that regional water organizations are created to manage the Sea Area Basin as part of the broader Aral Sea Basin that you probably heard of during these conferences. And the water quotas allocation that existed during the USSR period are kept almost as they were. Because also of the power differential, the power asymmetry that I mentioned before between upstream countries and downstream countries. So we have a situation where, for instance, Kyrgyzstan that controls 70% of the water flowing in the shared area have less than 10% allocated for water withdrawals, which is not to the taste of upstream countries like Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, who aim to raise water quotas and especially develop water infrastructures, hydropower, and manage water according to their needs, while downstream countries want to have the same quota allocation, but also the same management of the river flow, because they're using water for irrigation, which means that they need the peak water to be in summer. Except that if upstream countries want to produce hydropower, it's in winter when they need it because, well, it's very cold in Central Asia in winter, so they need to heat the cities. But if they use reservoirs and hydropower dams to run the turbines in winter, then the reservoirs are empty in summer for irrigation. That's the main problem with the management of the shared area. Well, with all other problems. In all of these contexts, we have climate change. We have a decreasing snow cover, which is an essential part of the water flow. And we have ice melting in the glaciers. We have lost already a lot of the glaciers, which are really important for this peak in summer that I mentioned for irrigation. And except if we should see in the short to medium term phase of increasing water flow because of the melting of ice, starting a tipping point to the medium long term, they will start to have a decrease in water. And that is in parallel of change in seasonality of this peak of river flows that I mentioned, which is really important for especially downstream countries. So what I did first was to list all water events occurring in the Sierra Basin. I used a lot of water events, water conflict database that I completed with an analysis of various media to have a most precise list I could, as well as, and I did also a grading, scaling of these events according to the basin at risk scale in order to have just an overview of what was happening in terms of cooperation and conflict. And you can see that in the beginning, first year, you have a lot of what seemed important in terms of cooperation. You have the creation of a regional basin organization. However, this cooperation, what is usually seen as cooperation as positive, is not necessarily in this context of power asymmetry positive cooperation, because it actually, in my sense, led to a lot of the tension you can see in the year after, because it froze a situation, allocation of water allocation of quotas that were non-beneficial to upstream countries that started to just ignore the agreements, ignore the regional cooperation. And I can mention, for instance, that since 2016, Kyrgyzstan is no longer a real part of the basin organization, the IFAS, managing the RLC basin, and is no longer part of this process. So we can see here an aggravation of conflict in recent years. Water is one of the factors, and I cannot stress this enough, water is only one of the factors among others, because you have problems with the borders, with the enclaves, different ethnicities, political will, of course. But at the same time, we have a lot of important, and especially in the past 3 years, important cooperation dynamics. Yeah, I won't. And we have agreement and the creation of regional water organization. Yeah, are not necessarily positive. I already said that. I'll pass. And this coexistence of conflict and cooperation can be seen as different scale. So right now I'm looking at the scale of the basin, but for my project I did a lot of interviews and I spent a lot of time in Kyrgyzstan mostly. And you can see this coexistence of conflict and cooperation dynamics at the community level as well, which is very interesting. I don't have much time left, I think, so I'll go quick with that. As I mentioned, I did a lot of interviews with water stakeholders, as well as with a survey with university students to have a perception, an insight of their perception of the future related to climate change linked to water and conflict or cooperation. And many people, when talking about the future and the relationship between either conflict, cooperation, and water, express they felt more conflict was coming at the local scale, but also at the broader scale. But well, also new opportunities and such. And so in all these contexts of the Syria Basin, climate change, water, conflict cooperation, all of these are linked and linked intrinsically, I'll say. And dealing with climate change impact in the region on water, in my case, involve developing initiatives for adaptation because, well, as you saw, climate change will have huge impacts on water. However, they need also cooperation to prevent maladaptation. And even in basin with regional water organizations like the Sirdaria, cooperation is not taken for granted. And as I mentioned, it's still I'm still working on this project, but I created a graph to try to kind of map the relationship between cooperation, conflict, adaptation in the context of climate change impact on water. So specifically on water. And I would like to hear your thoughts about it if you think more relations should be added. So yeah, maybe I don't have the time to delve into that. Do I? No, I don't. Okay. So to conclude, I would say that the coexistence of conflictive and cooperative dynamics mostly triggered by water, but also a multitude of factors. And despite agreements and regional organization, which are usually described as positive for corporations, tension remains and can even be fueled by this so-called cooperation. And climate change is having already and will have strong impacts on water in the region, and so adaptation is a necessity. But cooperation at the basin scale is mandatory to prevent negative impacts. Yeah, and adaptation and conflicts are linked in both negative and positive feedback loop. Yeah.
Thank you, Eugénie. Right, and I think it's worth pointing out in that the Wolf et al. Plus minus of conflict and cooperation, that their evidence shows that it's state-based, and states, they conflict and cooperate on this, basically on the same things. It's around quantity and it's around infrastructure to deal with quantity. So it would be interesting to do a further breakdown about what did you find? What do they cooperate on? What do they conflict on? Something like that, right? And then also for yours, it would be interesting to know more about your methodology and where the data came from and so on. Okay, thank you very much. We're more or less on time, mostly less, but that's okay. We're just, next comes the reception. So big party's coming so that everybody can be patient. Yeah, so the third paper is brings from soon to be doctors to recently minted PhD, Dr. Juliane Schillinger. She just finished her PhD, if you haven't heard yet, at the University of Twente with a dissertation on the impacts of armed conflict on water management. Next to her research at the intersection of water, climate, and conflict, she is a technical advisor for the Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Center on Climate Adaptation and Disaster Risk Reduction in Conflict-Affected Settings and member of the NPAC's board. We're partners in crime on this project, NPAC's board of directors. And in this paper, her co-author is seated 1, 2, 3, 4th row over there. And that's Professor Gul, how do you say her last name? Özerol. Yeah, Gul Özerol.
Thank you, Larry. And yeah, I think partners in crime in terms of driving Carl crazy, maybe. Yeah, so we're shifting gears a little bit from talking about conflict and cooperation over water to essentially flipping it around and talking about the impact of conflict on water And we're going away from Central Asia, we're going to the Middle East, because where else would we go? As Larry said, this is based on my dissertation, which was a little bit more than a paper. If you're interested, there's going to be a QR code to get the entirety of it at the end. And just to get us a little bit into the headspace for this discussion, and maybe also to the discussion on Ukraine afterwards. Essentially, I want to tell you the story of this photo. I very much agree with the approach to put your fieldwork photos into presentations, because that's really how we connect to topics. So we need to see them in front of us. So I took this photo back in 2018, in October 2018. It's very subtle in terms of where it's from. So it was in the Gaza Strip, the wastewater treatment plant of Gaza City. To give you a little bit more of a clue of where we are and what we're seeing, this is a satellite photo from roughly around that time. And so we have the plant itself here, Gaza City itself sort of going a little bit out of the picture there, the Mediterranean in the upper corner over there. And so this is an area that houses, or housed at that point, roughly 750,000 people, all more or less served by this wastewater treatment plant. Now let me put a somewhat depressing layer on top of that. This is the suspected infrastructure damage in the area since October 2023. We can see in yellow sort of where we think there's infrastructure damage, or I say we, the United Nations Satellite Program thinks that there's infrastructure just based on where they have confirmed damages. So then it goes basically over orange, red to darker red, where there's confirmed destroyed infrastructure. And I'm gonna walk into the slide again. You can see a tiny red dot here. That's the wastewater treatment plant. So that is presumably severely damaged at this point. You can see basically everything you would see in the background at sort of this area. So most of those buildings are probably not standing anymore. And that gives a pretty grim overview of the situation. But it's also only a tiny, tiny sliver of the actual story. And so what you don't see on a map like this, on an infrastructure damage assessment like this, is that if you had been me back in 2018 taking this photo, you would very much wish to be somewhere else, because apart from everything of like being in a Gaza Strip, your nostrils would essentially be assaulted by this very, very strong smell of rotten eggs, smell of sulfur that you get in a wastewater treatment plant like this that doesn't really have electricity. So they're limited to very, very rudimentary wastewater treatment practices. That also means that a lot of the wastewater that isn't properly treated will seep into the groundwater. And so you get pollution of the local water resources essentially for all of the communities around here. You also can't see that there's still people working there. These people should be paid, but actually getting the money to pay those salaries is a massive challenge in a setting like the Gaza Strip at that point, and even more now, of course. So we have this whole sort of universe of complex impacts of a conflict on water management processes that affect the access to water just in a very basic sense for communities, that affect the quality of the water that is available if you can access it, and that has implications for example, for health, for food security, specifically here, for example, the health of pregnant women, the health of babies. And so you get a whole wide range of impacts of conflict on water management, but also on everything that relies on water. That is okay to know in that sense. The problem is we don't actually know that much. Because for the past decades, whenever we talked about water and conflict, we talked about water wars, we talked about the potential for cooperation, and we never really talked about these kind of dynamics. We never really talked about the conflict impacts. And so on a conceptual level, we have no clue. We have no clue of what's going on here. And that has some pretty severe implications. First up, we don't know how to actually stop the sort of deteriorations of water services that we see in a lot of conflict settings. As conflicts protract, and most of them do these days, services get worse and worse and worse. You get infrastructure damage, you get issues with the access to different chemicals, and with every single impact, these accumulate, it gets worse and worse and worse. And so you get this downward spiral. That also means that every time it gets worse, it gets harder to reconstruct afterwards. It also means that from a humanitarian perspective, if we don't really know what the impacts are going to be, we are not going to be very effective in responding to them. And if we take it a little bit further, we are even worse in anticipating any of those impacts and see how we can potentially mitigate civilian harm before it really happens. It also means we're probably not even supporting the local actors we should be supporting, because there is still quite some capacity in those conflict settings. There are different local actors, there are utilities, there are civil society organizations, there are private actors that could do water management if they got the right support. But we don't know enough about it to find those kind of actors. And lastly, and that is, if this part is of interest to you, you're in the wrong session, you should be over there. The application of international humanitarian law, which in theory protects water infrastructure, protects the access to basic services, protects everything that is indispensable to the survival of civilian populations, and water is very, very high on this list. However, a lot of these impacts are the sort of reverberating effects that slowly meander through systems. And it's really, really difficult to sort of trace those back and to get to a point where we can actually operationalize our knowledge on conflict impacts to the degree that would be necessary to actually enforce IHL. So what do we do about that? Well, what I did about it is 7 years ago, wrote an email to the lady over there. Basically, I went to Google, I was like, so I have this crazy idea. And what this crazy idea turned into was a 6-year PhD project that included 12 case studies across the Middle East, covering Syria, Iraq, Palestine, and Yemen, to just really look at, hey, what is happening in local water management in armed conflict settings? There is a lot in every single of these cases. There's a reason the dissertation is about 300 pages long. If you're interested, read the book, because I don't have that much time. But so essentially, a lot of empirical insights from all of these different cases. Some of them included field work, some of them were supposed to include field work before COVID happened. Some of them were just based on a lot of secondary data from different organizations. Yeah, so there's a couple of papers that came out of it. All of these are available open access, or should be available open access. I'm not 100% sure about this one, but it's the MPEX journal, so if you remember, you should have access anyway. A lot of stuff in there, but sort of looking at the actual big results we want to talk about, right? Is sort of this notion that we need to unpack what conflict impacts really mean and how they really work. So we need to identify what the different connections between those kind of impacts are, whether there are feedback loops. We already saw sort of those feedback loops between climate and resource endowment, electricity.
Yeah.
So we really need to figure out those feedback loops, what drives this just ongoing deterioration of services, of management processes. And we need to understand, of course, the short-term implications of conflict impacts, but also what is happening on a longer time frame, because conflicts are not short-term. They are very long-term processes, and so we need to understand those as well. The way that I've found most useful for this is systems approaches, which really allow us to kind of map out different elements of a water management process, of a water management system, to say, how does the infrastructure relate to sort of more operation and maintenance processes? How does that relate to regulations, to finances, to the natural resources themselves, and eventually to the people who are actually using the water? And how can we, through this system, sort of trace back what is going on here? That is a little bit abstract so far, so let me tell you a couple of the sort of the very, very high level actual empirical results. Most important one, infrastructure damage. Of course, it's everywhere. And quite often infrastructure damage is kind of what kicks off these spirals of deterioration. But also quite often, it's not necessarily the driver throughout. Something breaks. In an ideal world, we can then go and fix it. But in most conflict settings, there are a lot of different elements that mean that repair of infrastructure is actually not possible, or that maintenance of infrastructure is not possible. And so damages get worse and worse and worse. And one of the key elements that have been missing in a lot of the discussions on these kind of processes is the second point here. We need money. If you look at anybody talking about water services in armed conflicts, they will tell you it takes three different things. It takes the infrastructure, it takes sort of the consumables, the machinery, all of the equipment you need to keep it running, and then it needs people. It needs the staff. What they never tell you for some reason is that it also needs money to pay for all of that. And quite often, money is just not available because you're in a conflict. Your government gives the money to higher priority issues, mostly the conflict itself. And international support is generally patchy at best. Humanitarians are underfunded. So money really plays a big role here. The third point that came out of looking a little bit more into coping strategies for different communities was that household level water treatment is absolutely crucial to limit civilian harm from a lot of these conflict impacts. Because people are actually really creative. People are very, very good at finding new sources of water if they have to. The problem is quite often, those are not the safest sources around. There might be pollution already. It might just be outdated infrastructure. And so water quality is generally a key topic and leading to massive health implications. But if you're able to treat your water at home, you're reasonably good. So having these household level capacities basically enables communities to keep using all of those flexible alternative solutions. And then the last part that really came out of looking at the different actors that are involved in those management processes is that quite often international organizations are quite the gatekeeper and sometimes quite the bully in terms of deciding who actually gets to manage water, who gets to be involved in governance processes. And sometimes that's not the people who are the most relevant. In that case, I'm going back to the example of Gaza because it's such a striking example. A lot of the international organizations, especially those linked to Western countries, have very strict no-contact policies to Hamas. It's a terrorist organization, makes sense. The problem is Hamas is also a political party in Palestine. And since they've been in control of the Gaza Strip since 2006, all of the local councils in the municipalities have been stacked with Hamas politicians. So all of the municipalities are considered Hamas as well, and there's no contact with them. So international organizations come in with their ideas of water management, and they don't talk to the municipalities because of those no contact policies. Let me just tell you, it generally doesn't go so well. So what does this mean in more practical sense? We have this deterioration of basic services. We have more protracted conflict, for some reason I'm starting from the bottom. And then we also put climate change on top of that. As Larry mentioned, I'm also working at the moment with the humanitarian sector. And in the humanitarian sector, this combination of issues is putting us in a really, really tricky position because we really need to reflect on how we're actually doing the kind of work we're doing. Humanitarian assistance was always seen as the sort of emergency, short-term, we're in, we're providing some stuff, we're out again, then we're leaving it all for the development organizations to fix the rest. Humanitarian assistance is not short-term anymore, it's a very long-term process. And that means we need to rethink what we're actually doing and what our ways of working are. So hopefully some of the work in this dissertation will influence those processes of rethinking our ways of working, who we're working with, how we're supporting them, and how we're providing funding to those settings. Maybe it just doesn't work anymore to say, well, we will fund you a new piece of infrastructure, we will build this, and then we will leave, good luck operating it. Because if you don't provide the continued finance to actually operate and maintain this infrastructure, it's gonna last maybe 2-3 years, and then it's gonna be gone again, and all of your initial investment is essentially lost. Considering we don't have a whole lot of humanitarian funding available, with a lot of governments now cutting back on the financial support to humanitarian organizations, we really need to be more efficient in what we're doing with this money. And that means really thinking about how are we using it and what kind of impacts do we want to reach. then the last important part again for the people in that room, so maybe I should just sort of address the wall. We need to keep pushing for international humanitarian law. There are some states at the moment that really don't care about it. I'm not sure if we can really change that. It's probably up to some of those people higher up. But what we can do is make it as easy as possible to abide by IHL. And that means to sort of unpack this lofty term of reasonably foreseeable impacts, which basically means what can you reasonably guess might happen as a consequence of your military operation. So what might those impacts on civilians be? And so work like this really goes into unpacking civilian harm, what that means, how reverberating impacts are potentially leading to far larger civilian harm that you might initially think. And so we really need to keep working on strengthening this evidence base, essentially on those reverberating impacts, on civilian harm, on a lot of nice things. I would recommend to rewatch the session happening over here on the Global Alliance on the protection of water during armed conflicts, because that is one of the things we're doing with the Alliance. And so, yeah, essentially this dissertation is hopefully helping to some extent. Now, if you want to know more, there's a handy QR code. And if you're not Larry, who immediately takes out his phone, I do also have them on paper, so feel free to take one of those. That's it. Thank you for your attention. And I guess I'll leave it to the colleagues from and on Ukraine.
Thank you very much. And you were the closest to stay on time, so that shows what happens once you get your PhD, you become a better time.
You know what it is? Because I had to make this presentation for the defense, and they were very strict about how long you're allowed.
Okay. All right, so from the Middle East now we go to the Ukraine, we've also have a gender shift here. We heard from 3 women, and now we're moving to 3 men. And so this will be co-presented, I think, right? Yeah, unlike the last paper. So we've got 2 presenters. We've got Dmytro Koval. How did Ukraine do in the soccer the other day? Not very good. Yeah.
Why would you ask?
We won't talk about that. He's an associate professor at the National University of Kyiv-Mohyla Academy. His current research focuses on the International Criminal Court's influence on post-conflict societies' collective memory. In 2015 to 17, he served as a member of the Ministry of Justice Expert Committee on International Humanitarian Law Implementation, and also contributed to the monitoring reports of the Truth Hounds, Ukrainian Helsinki Human Rights Union, Crimea's SOS, and other NGOs on the compliance of the parties in armed conflict in Ukraine with the international humanitarian law provisions and other things. He's done other things too. And his co-author here is Pascal Turlan. He's an international lawyer and international relations expert. He is the legal and program director for the US-based NGO project Expedite Justice. I like the action side of both of your profiles, heading the Ukraine program of the organization. He's also adjunct professor at Sciences Po and lectures on international criminal justice for the French School of Magistrates. Prior to this, Monsieur Turlan worked for 19 years in the office of the prosecutor of the ICC, most recently as the judicial cooperation advisor to the prosecutor, and other things. So you can find them both online. It's we're very happy to have you both here today, and the floor is yours. Let's see how the men do with timing relative to the women. Not that it's a competition.
Not a competition. No. Thank you very much, Larry. Thanks, and thanks all for your interest in this. So I'm not sure whether we should be in the next room or whether we are following exactly where we should be after your presentation. So we're both lawyers, so this is a legal part of this session here. I think what's interesting is that we are coming after, so we're coming after all the destruction, but we're coming with a report which is about evidence gathering, collection of evidence in view of prosecuting crimes against the environment. I think that flows logically. I will stick to this instead of moving to the next room and doing it in the next room. So with Koval, we'll speak about this report that we released 2 weeks ago. We released it on 6th June, which is the 1st year anniversary of the destruction of the Kakhovka Dam in southeast of Ukraine. We've been working in Ukraine, Dmytro Koval has been working in Ukraine for many years, but Project Expedite Justice has been working in Ukraine since 2022, immediately after the full-scale invasion, and we've been partnering with Hounds on this project and actually on other investigation projects. What we do is investigating war crimes, and in particular war crimes against civilian infrastructure, destruction of the agrarian resources, pillage of agrarian resources, sanction violations, and we work on damage to the environment as well. So the Kakhovka Dam is or was a hydropower plant in the southeast of Ukraine. It was destroyed on 6 June 2023, and it flooded all the areas downstream and dried up the areas upstream and the reservoir. So this is some images of the explosion. We're not going to go through all of the images that we have. You can find them in the report. The report is online. If you don't want to go back home with a brick, you can find the report online, and all the annexes are also online. The report is about the causes, responsibilities, consequences, and legal characterization of the explosion and of the destruction of both the dam and the reservoir itself. We presented conclusions that, in our view, point very convincingly at the Russian Federation responsibility for the destruction of the dam, and that are looking at options for accountability for the perpetrators of this explosion. And we're looking in particular at using the Rome Statute of the ICC under Article 8.2b4, which we think is adequate and for which we think we meet all the criteria necessary to demonstrate it is a war crime. This dam that we see some sketch here has played a vital role in southern Ukraine since the 1950s. It provided electricity, irrigation for agriculture, drinking water for the settlements in the area. It supported a rich ecosystem, and it's a UNESCO World Network of Biosphere Reserve sites. So the report has been looking at, sorry, I was going back up, various aspects of the dam destruction. So we looked at evidence-based finding on those responsible, and we concluded Russian military actors are responsible for the destruction. We looked at legal analysis to hold perpetrators responsible. We looked at the consequences for the local economy, for the agricultural resources, at the environmental impact on water resources, on biodiversity, on soil health, the human cost of the disaster, including loss of life, displacement, health risks, and the findings on the potential war crimes committed in light of the excessive damage compared to the unclear military objectives pursued by the Russian armed forces. So Dmytro will go into details on pushing the limits of the law before the International Criminal Court. I mean, no more details than 10 minutes, I promise. But I will focus on two initial aspects of this investigation. The first one is the necessity to work together, and the second one, and I think that's also following what colleagues were saying earlier about collaborative work, and the second one is about the relevance of using the Rome Statute framework for this crime. So the first point is that this investigation benefited from and demonstrated the need for collective intelligence to address collective victimization for such massive crimes. In general, we tend to think in silos, and those working on IHL, working on ocean human rights investigation, working on climate change are not the same people. International environment law experts and IHL experts are not necessarily the same people. Some people are actually very good in both, but people are coming from different places usually. Our objectives, the values pursued may not always be the same. And yesterday I was listening to Stavros Pandakopoulos, who was explaining exactly this, that it's difficult sometimes to merge these two aspects because the objectives we are pursuing are not necessarily the same. In this case, though, we are in a situation where objectives are matching and where we have to tackle the investigative and legal challenges associated with both areas of law, with demonstrating war crimes and with meeting the right legal threshold to demonstrate that there is an excessive damage, with a lot of scientific information to bring in to demonstrate this damage. So some of the challenges we met included working on a very large area, large territory with a very wide scope of damage, very wide temporally, very wide spatially. with no access to some of the areas. Some of the areas are still under occupation. Some of the areas are under heavy shelling still up to date. So we couldn't access these places, with difficulties to reach to the victims because people are moving because of the flooding, because people are not necessarily willing to speak, because people are difficult to identify. We also have, of course, invisible victims. So we're talking about people that are affected by the explosion and destruction, but who may not know it yet, because the damage of the explosion and the damage will last for long, but it's not necessarily visible immediately. So that's what was interesting this morning, for instance, the presentation by our colleague Maxim Popov about the fact to look at long-term contaminations through hair sample, for instance. We also have, of course, ecosystems as direct victims. We have no voice to testify and who are not speaking to us. So you have to look at helping them through the ecosystems to actually bring their voice to the investigation. So investigating this incident has forced us as international human rights or international criminal law lawyers and investigators to expand beyond our usual skill set and to actually work hand in hand with researchers from various scientific backgrounds. This is a participatory approach that was discussed on several occasions today in different ways. So at the end, what was supposed to be a legal analysis on the attack ended up in a multifaceted report touching on a very wide variety of areas, very far from our initial skill set and expertise. So this showed, and I think the real point is here, it showed that it's very important to build up our collective endeavor and our collective strengths to actually address this large-scale crimes. The dam's destruction, so I will not go through all the details of the different consequences and impact of the dam and all of the different types of analysis that we had to do. The destruction led to widespread and catastrophic environmental impact. We had to bring in colleagues to analyze the loss of aquatic habitats, the long-term damage to biodiversity, the damage on the Black Sea Biosphere Reserve, the imbalance between freshwater and saltwater ecosystems, and the ensuing deaths among flora and fauna. We had to look as well at the fact that while the downstream river was flooded, the former dam reservoir was dried up. So this caused very negative impacts, soil degradation and pollution that are likely to impact the area for decades to come. So to assess this damage and this multifaceted damage, we had to bring in many experts. So we brought in hydrogeological experts, people experts in flora and fauna, water resources experts, agriculture experts, soil contamination experts. We worked with Greenpeace, Central and Eastern Europe team to assess the damage and the impact on the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. We worked with EOS data analytics to look at satellite imagery, analysis and visualization of the flooding and visualization of the differences. You saw an image a bit earlier. And we worked, of course, with our own teams in Hounds and in Project Expedite Justice to actually conclude on the economic, agricultural, resources impact in the region. So thanks to this coordinated approach, we have gathered evidence that, in our view, demonstrates the excessive extent of the damage and that supports a finding that implicates Russia in this excessive damage, in the destruction of the dam, and in the disproportion between the explosion, the destruction, and the unclear military objective that was allegedly pursued by the Russian armed forces. So this is the one among the examples that you can find in the report of the evidence and open source intelligence that we have found in relation to this report. So moving on to the second point, and I see it's already getting short. So we are trying now to contribute to the development of international practice for addressing environmental crimes. For addressing environmental crimes. And we are very happy to see already that the work we've been doing with the Office of the Prosecutor General, with colleagues of Maxim Popov, who you have seen many times already since yesterday, and rightly so. We are very happy to see that our report might be received as evidence in the work that they are doing, that our cooperation, coordination has helped them to some extent, and that some notice of suspicions have already been issued in relation to people who might be responsible for these crimes. We will continue to stand by the side of the Ukrainian national authorities to assist with prosecuting this crime before the Ukrainian national authorities in complementarity with the ICC. Quite a lot of work has been done at the national level, and we will be available to continue assisting in this work. As you know, as been discussed before, on the IHL, the threshold for prosecuting environmental crimes is very high, under Article 33 and 35, for instance, and it has not yet led to meaningful judicial action. Fortunately, we have Article 8.2b4 of the Rome Statute that allows to prosecute this crime as well, and we're looking forward to actually demonstrating that this article is the right framework to prosecute this specific crime. This is an endangerment offense, and Dmytro will develop on this aspect, where the criminality arises from the potential for an attack to entail environmental damage. So this is the right vehicle in this case, and all the work that we've been doing has been to gather, collect the evidence and the legal analysis to make it possible and to assist in doing this. The ICC Office of the Prosecutor has not yet used this article to prosecute crimes against the environment. It's been used for different reasons. It's been used recently in the warrant of arrest against commanders Koval and Sokolov in relation to the targeting of the energy infrastructure of Ukraine, but not in relation to the excessive damage to the environment. Because of the Rome Statute preamble, the state parties' commitment to address these crimes that threaten the well-being of the world, because of the policy paper on case selection that was issued in 2016, where the prosecutor explicitly stated that crimes against the destruction of the environment should be considered a gravity criteria for the selection of cases, and because of the consultations that started a few months ago that Kyiv-Mohyla mentioned this morning in the plenary session, we believe it is the right moment to actually go and try to prosecute this crime before the International Criminal Court. If you've been in the plenary this morning, Professor Kyiv-Mohyla explained that there is consultations on 16th of March until 16th of February, actually. On 16th of March, they closed the initial phase of the consultation, so they are drafting a new policy paper on crimes against the environment. When they have a draft ready, they will circulate it again for comment. So it will be the right time to also bring information and bring input into this policy paper. So it's because we have this option, and I'm concluding here and passing the floor to Dmytro, because we have, so the first one in Ukrainian works very well. The second one, you have to then open different pages to access the report, but you can access the report in English as well on the second QR code.
Okay, I thought you were finished because
yes, I'm finished. So we have this article. This article is available. It's still very difficult to meet the threshold, but we will show.
But what I'm saying is that you used the time for 15 minutes for your whole paper. So what are we going to do with David here? We have to respect David.
10 each. Sorry.
Yeah. So I think we have to stop it here and let David, because we're going to run out of time.
We can split the difference.
Are you sure?
Yeah.
Well then, sorry, that's my mistake. I didn't know we had 15 for 2.
You know, you actually
that was
you had
individual.
10 for 2, but I let you go 15, thinking you were finished. So rather than wasting time on debates, if you want to take 2 or 3 minutes, that's fine. I mean, this is fascinating and important work, so I hate to be the policeman.
It will be challenging to finish my part of the presentation in 2 minutes, but I will just make back a couple of points that are the most important for our discussion. First of all, during the previous presentation, we discussed how IHL is inadequate on responding to threats that are coming, that are resulting from the attacks on water infrastructure. And in these cases, it's more or less understandable why it's so, because the results, the impacts actually are quite remote from the initial attacks. But in cases like Kakhovka, the IHL should be better equipped on the first glance to respond to the attacks. Unfortunately, it's not the case. And it's not the case because of the inadequacy of international humanitarian law. In the 1970s, when the norms that should have protected the environment were constructed, nobody really consulted with the environment. Environment doesn't have its agency. And for that reason, the threshold, Pascal mentioned that for protection of the environment is very, very high. So basically, in the whole Rome Statute, there is only one article mentioning environment, and that is Article 824. And that's basically the reason why we try to build our case for this, for the International Criminal Court based on this article, because it's the only way to bring environment to the picture. So what are the what we are calling for by this report is basically to use this opportunity to innovate international law without changing its substance. So we do not believe that Rome Statute or the Additional Protocol 1 will be changed in the nearest future. So the only way to adapt to the condition that we are seeing is to develop it through the practice. And we see three main points where this development may happen. The first point would be the definition of attack. So the Article 824 may be used only when the attack occurs. So it's the so-called attack-related crime. I mean, it's counterintuitive to many of you, but exploding something on the territory that you occupy may not be an attack from the IHL standpoint. And for that reason, it's really complicated to start building even the case. So we think that in the practice, it's possible to a bit shape a different way the idea of attack. So what do we mean by that? First of all, we can take into consideration the travaux préparatoires, the preparation of materials to the Additional Protocol 1, that basically say that this distinction between attack and destruction was made to protect the sovereign right to destroy dams when the sovereign is under the attack. So basically, if the party is protecting its territory, sovereign territory from the invasion, it can blow up the dam, but not the party that actually tries to occupy more territory. So that's one thing. The other thing that is attack is the use of so-called water bombs. So when the water is used to flood the territory that is being occupied by the army of the other party. So that's also an attack. So that's one of the innovations. The other innovation is to proclaim this crime as an inchoate crime. I will not go into details, but basically it's about the crime of endangerment. So what I'm trying to say that it's not necessary for this crime to establish all the consequences that followed the attack on the environment. It's rather important to see what could have happened. And this what could have happened actually influences or shapes the classification of the acts. And third, and the most important probably, is clearly defining three categories that are three adjectives that are used in the Article 824. And those adjectives would be long-term, widespread, and severe. They are somehow defined in international law, but in a very specific way. For instance, long-term means more than 20 years. So the impact of the attack, for instance, should be felt for 20 plus years. Widespread means hundreds of square kilometers. We don't have the exact number, but it should be at least 200 square kilometers plus. And then severe is not defined at all. And basically severe is understood as the factor that severely impacts the human life on the territory. So those things should be defined, and we propose actually the ways how we can define and how we can measure whether certain damages to the environment may be classified as widespread, long-term, and severe. And I will stop here. So
it's fantastic. Yeah, thank you so much. All right, last but not least, David.
Well, maybe least.
David Katz. Thank you. As chair, I take full responsibility for letting everybody go long, but everybody's interested. So what can you do?
Like they're only serving drinks at 6 anyway, right?
Yeah.
The like first half hour is dry.
Yeah. So David Katz is a faculty member in the School of Environmental Sciences at the University of Haifa in Israel, and is currently visiting scholar at Duke University in the United States. His research focuses on natural resource policy and economics, with a specialization in transboundary water management in the field of environmental peace building. Over the last 30 years, he's worked with and for various NGOs and intergovernmental organizations, working on transboundary water, wastewater, and energy projects in the Arab-Israeli context. Floor is yours. I apologize for the limited time, but we are all patient and interested, and you have our undivided attention.
Okay, so, well,
Off we go.
Starting well. What is going on? Okay. So if we really are short on time, I'll just say this is what I'm talking about, and then we can all go and get drinks. So we're seeing a lot more desalination around the world, and I'm going to claim that it has the potential to fundamentally challenge a lot of the assumptions that we have about how water is managed, especially in transboundary basins. But it's not a silver bullet. It can do a lot of good, but it can also aggravate and entrench some kind of problems, and we'll look at that as in examples. So one of the basic ideas in transboundary water, and this group probably knows it better than most people in the world, is that upstream parties have a significant advantage, right? So there's interdependency, but it's asymmetric. And the best quote I have on this is from Özerol, just up the road in Wageningen, or however you pronounce that university, who wrote this in his master's thesis 30 years ago. Upstream users use water to get power, downstreamers use power to get water. Okay, so we all know there's a strategic advantage to being upstream. One of the other things that we know from the literature is that scarcity is always pointed to as a potential driver of both conflict and cooperation. But not only scarcity, also variability. Since we're in university, we'll use big words like stochasticity and uncertainty. Right? So, and different people, different schools of thought have different ideas about this, right? So, whether it's a zero-sum game or not, whether it's going to lead to conflict because there's only so much to go around, or it's going to actually force people to cooperate because there's a limited amount and people need to get together and sing kumbaya and work it out. And then there's also another sort of school of thought that says, well, people are innovative, they'll think of ways to deal with it. And a lot of times when we talk about desalination, it gets put in this category as, hey, we're going to work our way out of the scarcity problem. So we said that these are the critical factors: the geography, the upstream, downstream, the scarcity, the variability. And desalination is changing basic assumptions about all of these. So if we look at them, and it's changing about then how parties negotiate. So it's not an academic analysis, it's really, we'll see how it actually changes parties' behavior. First, I'll talk about super briefly, just trends in desalination. It's skyrocketing, especially as costs have gone down for desalination. That means nothing to you because it just shows that it's going up, but it doesn't show any kind of scale. But it's happening around the world. So people used to say, well, this is just the Middle East, this is just the oil-rich countries in the Gulf. But it's in over 150 countries around the world. It's primarily still in richer countries, but you can see it's in pretty much anywhere that has a seashore now, and even places that don't have a seashore. You can see it's in developing countries as well. So how does desalination change things? First of all, scarcity. It changes water from being a fixed source and therefore a zero-sum game to a potentially unlimited. I mean, clearly it's still limited, but unlimited for practical purposes. And then it just becomes a question of economics and investment. How much do we want to invest? It reduces uncertainty, not only about the quantity, but the timing, the quality, the placement of the water. So it reduces all these kinds of uncertainties, and therefore should be, in theory, reducing conflict. It also changes geography. Where upstream users are generally in the hills, whereas desalination done generally along the seashore, which is downstream. And so now it's giving a strategic option to downstream parties that they didn't have before. It's lessening their dependency, maybe even giving them some kind of advantage, but it's certainly changing their negotiating strategies. And it also changes ownership issues, which I won't get into because we're short on time. Okay, so Ram Aviram was a diplomat who did a lot of the water negotiations and the peace agreements between Israel and Jordan, Israel and Palestinian Authority, or PLO, at the time in the agreements in the 1990s. And he came to me and said, about 10, 15 years ago, said, you know, things are changing now with desalination. I can see like there's a lot of talk about potential new options for cooperation. We should think about this like as an academic paper. And so we did. We wrote a paper and we thought about it sort of strategically. And he had lots of evidence and I sat at a desk thinking. So it's mostly his idea and his data and me just sitting around. But thinking about it strategically, and we came to the conclusion that it should reduce conflict. But whether or not it increased cooperation is a whole other story, because it gives now states the option to not cooperate, right? Yeah. So if scarcity was the driver of cooperation, well, now they have another option. They don't have to, they can unilaterally go forward. And so we weren't sure about the conflict or about the cooperation part, but we thought it should reduce conflict. And that was sort of the first paper. We called it Desalination as a Game Changer. And there's lots of reasons why it should reduce conflict. It opens up all sorts of new options. So in the U.S., between the U.S. and Mexico, for instance, there's now options for, if they don't have the ability to provide water in the agreement, they're talking about building a desalination plant to meet the agreements, or maybe even instead of giving them water from U.S. giving water to Mexico from the Colorado River, just building them a desalination plant where they might need it more. There's lots of potentials for win-win. This is a project that I was involved in. It was originally an idea by Ecopeace, which is presenting all over this conference, including right now at another session. But they had the idea of potential water energy swaps. So Israel, which has access to the sea, desalinating water and sending it to Jordan, and Jordan, which has lots of desert area, making solar energy and giving it to Israel and Palestine. And we did a feasibility study that I led, and I'm an academic. They say, do a study, I'll do a study. I didn't think it was going to lead anywhere. This one actually, much to my own surprise, actually led to an agreement, which is now on hold, I guess, given what's going on in Gaza. But you can see the options for new agreements because of desalination. It's no longer if we get water, you don't. It's so there's lots of potential for new cooperation. But then there's the potential that we don't cooperate. So Singapore long depended on Malaysia for its water, and Malaysia knew that and extracted a lot of political leverage, a lot of concessions out of Singapore. A few years back, Singapore says no more. We're letting a 50-year agreement expire because we can desalinate. You don't have us by the short hairs anymore. We can do what we want. And so you can see that it might lead to less cooperation. It definitely changes for those who don't know this expression, BATNA, your best alternative to a negotiated agreement. This is sort of common terminology in negotiation literature. So you can see Singapore had an alternative to a negotiated solution, right? Sometimes you don't have an alternative. So Egypt was trying to leverage its political power, its diplomatic power against the creation of the dam, the Grand Ethiopian Dam, Renaissance Dam in Ethiopia. It didn't work. Immediately, it had the desalination as an option and went ahead and started developing desal plants. Sometimes it's just the threat of desalination that changes political behavior. So in this case, North Cyprus, the Republic of North Cyprus, right, was thinking about developing its own desalination, or even cooperating with the Republic of Cyprus. Immediately, Turkey said, "Wait a minute, we want to keep our leverage over you," and they built a canal, underwater pipeline to serve water to northern Cyprus. What Michael Mason from the London School of Economics called securing hydraulic patronage. In a later paper, when I started thinking about it more strategically, I thought, you know what, that statement that it should reduce conflict, it's probably true, but it might not be true. There's lots of cases when it's not true. There's cases when it might increase conflict. So I blame the editor of the first journal for not catching that and publishing. But there's lots of this is from lots of other researchers who've looked at desal, and these are pretty much common to all large infrastructure projects. That it's high cost and it has big environmental impacts, and it ingrains path dependency, meaning that you're stuck with it. It can be a way to avoid dealing with what are the real issues, the tough political issues or the efficiency issues. So those are all true. One that's especially true though for desal is this swapping water insecurity for energy insecurity, because it's very energy intensive. Yeah. So going back to the discussion on Gaza, the biggest issue with water access in Gaza right now is the fact that there's not fuel, right? So the water is still there. Most of the water is still there. There is obviously the infrastructure damage, but the real issue is that Israel is not letting in fuel because the fuel could be used for many, many purposes. And so there's no water to desalinate. The water is contaminated. There's no water for, there's no energy for desalination. There's no energy for pumping. And this is the real constraint. So, in one sense, you have a desalination, but you don't have, you've sort of solved your water security issues, but you've aggravated your energy security issues. And in intense conflict, this is going to be a huge issue. But there's also critiques that are specific to desalination. I know I'm out of time, but
That's okay.
So one thing we found, this is also Gaza, is, for instance, you're increasing your dependency on seawater quality, which was never the case. But if you're now, this is the case of in Israel, this is Ashkelon, this is Israel, this is Gaza City. Israel a few times had to shut down its desalination plant because of the sewage coming from Gaza, right? So, or if you have an oil spill off the coast. So you're now becoming more dependent on what I call the freshwater, marine water, or saltwater nexus. The other thing is that you can start to have conflicts over water that were never previously a conflict issue. So brackish water, nobody cared about it, right? Because it's brackish. But now that you can desalinate it, and it's cheaper to desalinate brackish water than seawater, now you can start fighting over it. So this is a nature reserve in the West Bank, and the Palestinians would like to desalinate it. The Israelis want to keep it as a nature reserve. This is near Uja, which I saw on your other slide. So I've done a lot of papers. I don't have QR codes because I'm not that sophisticated, but a lot of papers on this, including I give credit to Maureen Walthcott, who was a former PhD student of mine. And we have a couple of papers that really looked at systematically data sets and tried to evaluate, does it increase cooperation? Does it increase conflict in different settings? And I won't go into results. We don't have the time and you don't care. But if you do, you can look it up on Google. Look at her name. My name's generic. But we looked at it and we looked at cooperation separately from conflict because we know it can go either way. The basic idea, and we did qualitative as well as quantitative stuff. So the basic idea, the basic findings though are there are no clear trends. It doesn't, you can't make generalizations. You can't come to any conclusion that, yeah, just because there's desalination, it's reduced conflict or increased cooperation or reduced cooperation. It does seem to shift negotiation strategies of parties, but not in any clear, predictable, deterministic way. So it has a lot of potential to reduce conflict, but it can't be assumed. And generally what you see is just the effects of the larger political context in which desalination is taking place. And that's it.
All right, thanks a lot. Yeah, so that was very useful because my students are all obsessed with desal and they fight about it all the time. And send me your slides and I'll send it to them and I'll stop funny. You've all been so kind with your time. We're 8 minutes over time. I'm just going to adjourn the session and suggest that if you have questions for any of these universally excellent presentations. The soon-to-be doctors, the newly minted doctors, the lawyers, the old guys. You're more than welcome to find us at the bar and come and see the posters, and we'll link up then. So thanks so much for coming. Terrible timing. Oh, yeah. There's QR codes.
Yes, yeah, about. Yeah, so, that's. I don't know. Started off.
I went to put on my card, and also again, apologize earlier for interrupting your conversation with. I think there was something what I shared. Yeah, I was the one trying to get approach. Yeah, I was in New Berlin. I was in Asia.